Chances are you've had an MRI before, whether to diagnose an aching knee or the cause of a recurring headache. But what if doctors could peer inside your entire body to predict future health issues?
So this is the most sophisticated operating room in the world. If 10 years ago we were trying to write a futuristic script for a Hollywood movie about medical care in the future, we would have fantasized something like this.
MRI, short for magnetic resonance imaging, is becoming one of the most rapidly evolving technologies in medicine today. While doctors are already using full body MRIs to look for early signs of disease like cancer or dementia, celebrities are endorsing the technology and fueling the latest craze.
Why are Kim Kardashian and Kate Hudson and other celebrities posing with an MRI? They're promoting full-body scans for early detection of health issues.
If we actually leverage all the best tools, AI and our best clinical insights, and we look over time for individual people, then we can make medicine in the future proactive rather than reactive, make it predictive, and also make it protective.
That is Daniel Sodickson, a professor at NYU and one of the world's leading researchers on modern MRI innovation.
Just like a Google Maps for health, if you will. So Google Maps knows where you've been, it's mapped out the landscape, and it tells you what obstacles to avoid to get where you want to go. I think we're at the stage where we can start doing that for health.
Now Sodickson has published a new book called The Future of Seeing: How Imaging is Changing Our World.
The thing that I think excites me is it's no longer decades away. It's months and years away now, I think, from the tools I'm seeing, from the advances that are coming out.
This new imaging technology can catch diseases at their earliest, most treatable stages. It could detect the smallest abnormalities in our bodies, like a tumor, before it becomes cancerous, or the presence of blood clots or cysts, and even the earliest signs of dementia. But are there consequences of knowing too much about our health?
When we take an image of you, I guarantee you we will see something that is noteworthy. The question is, what do we do about it? Is it important? And in the old days, just doing a scan was a good way of alarming patients by producing these false positives. Here's the amazing thing. False positive rates aren't fixed. They're not God-given features of our imaging devices. We can drive them down by using context in the way I was just describing with AI. If we have prior context, the more we see you, the better we can predict, is this a new thing in you we need to worry about? Or is it just your personal individual baseline?
This technology is already revolutionizing health and medicine. Having access to our health in this way could possibly extend our lifespans and even prevent generational disease. And several companies are hoping to make full-body MRIs part of routine screening for everyone.
So what these companies are starting to try to do now is do longitudinal imaging. Imaging not just once, not just sort of a one-shot screen, okay, here are the findings, go do something about it, but instead following you over time so they can establish a baseline and really understand your individual health. And that's something that I think has a real shot of transforming medicine.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, welcome to Big Brains, where we explore the groundbreaking research and discoveries that are transforming our world. I'm your host, Paul Rand. On today's episode, the science of imaging and how full-body MRI scans could revolutionize health and medicine. Some of us pretty easily forget how extraordinary vision is, and I wonder if you can just take us back for a moment and just tell us why this concept, even of vision, became so compelling to you.
Well, I think the personal reasons are that somehow by sheer and wondrous accident, I ended up an imager, somebody who takes pictures for a living, in this case of the insides of people rather than the outside world. And over time, I started wondering, how is it that we humans first came to see in all these new and remarkable ways? And I think it actually began, as I came to realize, all the way back in the early oceans, when creatures first learned to figure out here from there. And it turns out that simple thing, just being able to tell here from there, was such a powerful evolutionary advantage that some people say it drove the Cambrian explosion, the sort of evolutionary explosion that led to all kinds of biodiversity, because those that could see, those that could map the world out spatially, knew where to find their food or knew how to run so that they didn't become food.
Gotcha. And so I guess if we go back and historically, is it the microscope, the telescope that really began that first evolution of enhancing our ability to look at images differently?
Absolutely. I would say that, there were magnifying glasses, there were eyeglasses. So spectacle makers were a big thing in the 15th, 16th centuries. But the ability to magnify dramatically came when someone figured out to put a couple of lenses in series. And then, boom, we had telescopes and microscopes. And that brought us the cosmos, sort of the notion that there is this vast reach beyond us, or the microcosmos, that there are all of these remarkable, strange creatures inside a drop of water.
Okay. And so I'm imagining from a philosophical point of view, that ability to enhance what we see also changes what we believe to be true or to be real.
It certainly does. And you can argue that it was the view through telescopes which led us directly to the Copernican revolution, one of those sort of seminal points in history when our view of ourselves and our place in the world fundamentally changed. We were no longer the center of the universe. We were just one little piece of it revolving around other entities. And I think you can trace that back to basically seeing differently.
The advances now in quote-unquote seeing or imaging have been increasing exponentially in recent years. Is that right?
That is true. I have never seen a time of greater flux, certainly in my experience, than we are now. And that's partly due to AI, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about. And it's partly due to all kinds of new technologies that are coming down the pipeline.
The real breakthrough in medical imaging, which we'll talk into great detail, is the X-ray. Talk to me about when the X-ray and how the X-ray was created and what that actually opened up for us.
Yeah, well, unlike for many discoveries, there was a concrete discovery date. 1896, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was fiddling around in his laboratory and discovered that a tube that he was using to explore some physics of what we now know are electrons caused a screen to glow in the background. And it turns out what he had discovered was what we now call X-rays. He, by the way, was a marketing genius. He called this thing X-ray, as in X for the unknown. And it sparked this huge X-ray fever afterwards. But basically, X-rays are just light on steroids, if you will. It's high-energy light that blasts its way through things that would otherwise be opaque. And that's what first allowed us to penetrate the veil of the skin, the skull, all those things that were impeding our view of the interior of our bodies.
And if you look at the evolution of medicine, how did the X-ray advance that field?
Well, before that time, it's almost hard to imagine physicians were really limited to exploring the outside of the body in order to deduce what must be going on inside. You could poke and prod, but there was no way without doing damage of opening up the body. And now all of a sudden the X-ray comes along and you've got a patient who, got hit by buckshot. And you're worried that there's something damaging an important organ. You shine an X-ray on it, boom, there it shows up, clear as day. And you can guide a surgeon. And this happened actually within the first year that X-rays were discovered. A doctor basically trained an X-ray machine on a poor guy who'd messed up with his gun and discovered where the bullet was and took it out.
Wow.
And so now you basically had access to the interior of the body before you went hunting.
But the CT scan came how many years later?
So in the 70s, we got CAT scanning, which is basically just taking X-rays from lots of different angles and working out the slice.
Yep.
We got MRI, which generated its projections, believe it or not, with magnets. We got PET scanning, which got its projections, I kid you not, from antimatter.
Wow.
And then we got ultrasound, which used high-frequency sound to generate projections.
Talk a little bit more about the process of how an MRI works, and when is the right time that somebody thinks a CT scan is going to work, and then when actually you ought to be thinking about an MRI?
Absolutely. Well, first a little bit about how MRI works. Believe it or not, inside the nuclei, inside the atoms, inside the water, inside you,
Okay.
there are these tiny little magnets, almost like compass needles. And if you put them in a really strong magnetic field, just like compass needles, they align. And if you then hit them with radio waves from a radio antenna of just the right frequency, they'll start zipping around in that magnetic field, and they generate a little radio signal. So believe it or not, under those circumstances, you and I and everyone are living, breathing radio transmitters. And it turns out that by tracking where the signal's coming from using these principles of tomography, you can generate a map of the water inside your body. So that's what an MRI is at baseline. It's a map of the wet tissues of the water. So what that tells you is a little bit about what MRI sees. MRI sees the soft, squishy tissues. Where you might use an MRI is where you really want to see what's going on inside the brain tissue, the heart, the liver, the prostate, the breast, things like that. Where you might want to use a CAT scan instead is where you're really interested in the bony structures, the hard structures. You want to see if there's a fracture. You want to see if there's calcium inside a coronary artery. Now, both of them can be used for either. That's where each one of them excels.
Okay. And the fields even of MRI are evolving, and you were instrumental personally in developing something called parallel imaging. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how that came up and why it was such a meaningful evolution.
Well, one reinvention I had the privilege of stumbling into was something called parallel imaging. So MRI, before that time, had been gathered more or less sequentially, almost like a scanner, right? If you have a digital scanner or an old-fashioned fax machine, I'm not sure how many of your listeners remember what a fax machine is, you sort of scan through line by line.
Yep.
Until you get the image. In the case of MRI, it was projection by projection, but it's the same idea. I was at the time, this was back in 1996, I was doing a rotation with a physician, a cardiac imager named Warren Manning, who liked to image the heart. And it's sort of considered bad form to stop the heart while you're imaging it. The heart is constantly moving, and you need to somehow capture that, so speed is important.
Okay.
Right? And I started asking myself, well, what are the limits? I knew nothing about MRI at that point. What are the limits of speed in MRI? Why is it slow? And it occurred to me it's slow because we're gathering one projection at a time. And so I just asked myself the question, is there a way of gathering multiple projections at the same time? Like getting 2 lines of the scanner or 3 or 4 lines of the scanner at once. And I realized that we were using these radio detectors to pick up the signal. What if we had an array of detectors in around different parts of the body? Could we use those to get multiple different projections in parallel? Turns out we could, hence parallel imaging.
Okay. And in terms of that advancing the science, how has that impacted how we operate today?
Well, interestingly, in medical imaging in particular, time is money. Time is of the essence, partly because you want to scan as many people as you can in these busy, expensive scanners, partly because it's hard for patients, particularly sick patients, to hold still. And there are parts of the body that, as I was talking about before, refuse to hold still, like the heart. And so what parallel imaging allowed us to do was to do all of the things that we could do before, but faster.
Got it. Now,
And
you
that,
call
I
this
think,
streaming perception. Is that the word you used for it?
Well, so in a way, it enabled something that I like to call streaming, as opposed to snapshots. The old tomography took a long time, almost like an old camera that needed a long exposure. But the faster we went, the more we could image life sort of in living color in real time.
Got it. And so are the majority now of MRI machines set up to work in parallel imaging?
They are. It certainly was very gratifying for me to see, because speed is so essential and so valuable. Manufacturers very quickly picked up the concept of parallel imaging and put it on their scanners. So now I'd say the majority of MRI scans taken around the world use parallel imaging in one way or another.
That's pretty impressive. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm proud and quite a bit humbled by that.
But you didn't stop there. You got involved in something else called compressed sensing. And tell us where this idea came from and how that has evolved.
Let's say you want to send somebody a photo in your email, right? You then get a question: do you want it small, medium, or large?
Right.
We compress the image in order to store it efficiently with something like a JPEG algorithm, something like that. But that leads to the question: if I can compress my data and throw away lots of these data points, why do I need to spend all this time gathering it in the first place? What compressed sensing is a way of cleverly figuring out pre-compression. Before you even know what's in the image, you essentially gather the data you need to get a compressed representation of it, almost like you're gathering the JPEG first and then uncompress it, rather than gathering all the data, taking a long time, and then figuring out what to throw away. So this pre-compression allowed us to speed things up even further, and it turned out compressed sensing worked really well in combination with parallel imaging too.
Okay, and how is that worked into the science that we're utilizing today?
Well, I think one really gratifying thing about working in the field of imaging is that as soon as you have a new development, it can propagate very quickly to all manner of disciplines. So, these acceleration techniques are being used clinically to image patients faster and clearer, but they're also being used in basic research to get more data in the same time, for example, to help characterize new types of diseases or even new types of materials in physics.
Okay. If I can pause for a second, and because we're going down the medicine path, but let's go back to other areas of our world where imaging is prevalent. And space exploration, telescopes you talked about. Can you spend a little time talking about the evolution, because we can certainly talk about Magellan and other advances in telescopes, but these are all parts of imaging. How has that imaging evolved as well?
People did not stop once they had developed these nice telescope or microscope tubes. They kept on tinkering and pushing the limits. And it turns out one of the things that in astronomy in particular was a key enabler was to make these tubes bigger. Okay. So basically bigger is better when it comes to astronomy because of the limits of spatial resolution.
Okay.
So we have had this remarkable explosion in the size and power of these artificial eyes that look out into space, to the extent that now we have something called the Event Horizon Telescope. And that's what gave us our first view a few years ago of a black hole, our first actual visual picture of a black hole.
Remarkable. Advances in imaging in one field inevitably leads to different understandings of how imaging can be used in other fields as well.
Absolutely. I think of imaging as one vast evolutionary tree in a way. People tend to think of astronomy or microscopy or medical imaging as very distinct disciplines, and often the people working in them kind of have their heads down and are focusing there. But actually, they're all branches of this great tree. I've had some extraordinary experiences sitting down with radio astronomers, for example, who have these huge dishes trained outward, and we have our MRI machines that are looking inside. I sat down with one radio astronomer back a few years ago, Urvashi Rao, whom I profile a little bit in the book, And as we were going through the talks we were supposed to give, these paired talks at a conference, bringing astronomers together with medical imagers, we discovered that our talks were basically the same. The mathematics underlying how we did radio astronomy were almost identical, with a few notation changes, to how we did MRI. So it turns out a radio telescope is like an MRI machine turned inside out. Who knew?
Remarkable. So now we are entering a whole new era. And I'm not sure what we call this era. I don't know if it's the AI era or if there's another terminology. How do you think about the new era of imaging that we're getting into?
Yeah, it is remarkable. I guess the way I think about it is a shift from emulating our eyes, the imaging sensors that we use to see, to emulating our brains as well. Because it turns out that the brains play a really outsized role in vision. The world we see, you and I, all of us watching, is in many ways a lie. Our brains are really good at taking rapidly streaming data that's not necessarily good enough on its own to give us a clear picture of the world, and filling in what's missing based on what we know about how the world works.
It really stood out, and that's remarkable, isn't it?
We don't give it much credence because, of course, vision is so fundamental to us. It's like breathing. We just do it.
Right.
But actually, our brains are constructing the scenes we see based on what we have learned as children about what's what in the world. So I think it's now becoming possible with AI, which is in many ways an artificial brain, to do some of the same things, to take much less data or much different data and fill in the gaps and allow us to image much faster, yes, but also allow us to image differently in a variety of potentially revolutionary ways.
I know your team is also working with AI and MRIs, and how prevalent is this becoming in going to our local hospital and getting an MRI?
What I'd say is what most people are familiar with is what I would call downstream AI. In other words, we get our data, we get our images, and then we let AI interpret it the way a human would, right? People worried from early on whether radiologists would be replaced by AI. Hasn't happened by a long shot yet. But there's also something very interesting and a little bit different, which I call upstream AI, which is that if we know we have these AI models on the other end, can we gather different data than we used to? Can we build different imaging machines than we used to that maybe don't have the perfect data we're used to working with, but use AI to fill in the gaps? And so I think what's really interesting is, even though, say, in MRI, we also had this similar bigger is better trend, just like astronomy, to get bigger and bigger magnets, in the last few years, there's been this remarkable less is more trend going in the opposite direction, trying to make MRI, for example, much more accessible to people around the world.
Okay. One of the points I want to pause on for a second is this idea, and radiology was predicted to be one of the first fields where AI was going to replace and radiologists were going to become a thing of the past. And as you mentioned, then there was a very public pronouncement that was going to be in the case. That didn't happen. And I wonder if you could explain why that did not happen.
Yeah, that public pronouncement you mentioned, by the way, that was 2016, Jeff Hinton, who is now a Nobel laureate and one of the godfathers of modern AI, basically said on camera, we should stop training radiologists now because within 5 years, AI will do their jobs better than they ever could. And of course, it's been more than 5 years since 2016, and I'm not aware actually of a single radiologist yet who's been replaced. I think that's for a number of interesting reasons. I think people, when they think of radiologists, tend to think of them as sort of pattern recognizers, object detectors. Like they go and they just scan an image. Is there a tumor? Is there a tumor? Is there a tumor? Nope, no tumor. Or, ooh, there's a tumor. Actually, the job of radiology is much more kind of cognitively rich than that. It's more like detective work than it is just like pattern recognition. So there's that. But also, actually, we can use AI to do things that no human ever could have before. Now, that said, I will pause on just one small irony, which is that though it was predicted that radiologists would be one of the first replaced by AI, now it's looking like it's programmers, coders, who might be replaced sooner.
Part of what AI is allowing, I think, getting back to this, is even a more democratization of the technology and making it more accessible. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why that is. Certainly you discuss speeding things up, but how is it allowing it to be more accessible?
That's a really good question, Paul. And it's not necessarily an obvious jump, but it is a powerful one. So in my group, we have been working for a few years now on something we call the Everywhere Scanner Project. The goal basically being to get scanners everywhere.
Yep.
And allow them to kind of fill in the gaps between times when we normally image. Normally, we pull out these big, expensive machines once we already know you're sick. But often that's too late. Often symptoms come when something is already untreatable or in any case difficult to treat. So the thought is, can we actually use imaging early, move it up in the diagnostic chain for early warning rather than just for guidance of therapy? But in order to do that, we obviously need cheaper, more accessible machines. And we need kind of automated detection of worrisome changes. And that's where AI comes in. AI basically is really good at detecting changes from, say, an earlier image.
And then we can compare over time, and the machine can also allow us to say, let's go back and look at 5 years worth of images to see what, if anything, has changed.
That's right. And so basically, if all we want to know is whether something has changed in you since your last MRI scan, then maybe we don't need a big $1 million machine. Maybe I can build an MRI machine into this seat I'm sitting in right now. So it can check, hey, has there been a change in your prostate health since the last time we scanned you with the big expensive machine? So it's because AI can kind of fill in what's missing, we can use these cheaper machines that we can get everywhere.
Tell me about Prenuvo. The discussion out there is people thinking that they need to get a whole body scan. And now we're going to have more others telling us that that's like a pretty good thing to be doing.
Absolutely. And full disclosure, I am an advisor, a scientific advisor for Ezra, which is a company that, like Prenuvo, although in a somewhat different way, does whole body scanning. Time was when you mentioned whole body screening in radiology circles, a chill would descend in the room because radiology was kind of burned by this in the past. There was this era when people were trying kind of mall scanners. And what would happen is they generate all kinds of false positives. So when we take an image of you, I guarantee you we will see something that is noteworthy. The question is, what do we do about it? Is it important? And in the old days, just doing a scan was a good way of alarming patients by producing these false positives. Here's the amazing thing. False positive rates aren't fixed. They're not God-given features of our imaging devices. We can drive them down by using context in the way I was just describing with AI. If we have prior context, the more we see you, the better we can predict, is this a new thing in you we need to worry about? Or is it just your personal individual baseline? So what these companies are starting to try to do now is do longitudinal imaging. Imaging not just once, not just sort of a one-shot screen, okay, here are the findings, go do something about it, but instead following you over time so they can establish a baseline and really understand your individual health. And that's something that I think has a real shot of transforming medicine.
Okay. And so you mentioned you're involved in a company called Ezra. Are they basically doing the same thing? Are they walk-in MRI whole body scan centers? Is that kind of the business model?
So at least originally they had a sort of similar overall model with a lot of individual differences that matter. Recently, interestingly enough, Ezra has been acquired by a company called Function Health, which does longitudinal blood testing as well. And now, in my view, we're starting to cook with gas because now in addition to the imaging, which tells you sort of the spatial features over time, you also have the chemical features over time, and down the line, genetic and proteomic features and all of this, which means you're going to be able to create with this ongoing data a kind of representation of your health today. And what AI models can do is they can track whether that representation is more or less staying the same or it's deviating. And what we want to do is we want to catch that deviation early before disease develops while it's still curable.
It's changing the way medicine is being practiced. And is that something that physicians feel good about, or how to control things? You mentioned false positives or other things that maybe we don't need to know.
Yeah, this is a source of ongoing debate, as it should be. I think there is still nervousness just because the details of how you do it matter. Just measuring without knowing what to do with the measurements is not enough. But what I believe is that if we actually leverage all the best tools, AI and our best clinical insights, and we look over time for individual people, then we can make medicine in the future proactive rather than reactive, make it predictive, and also make it protective. Just like a Google Maps for health, if you will. So Google Maps knows where you've been, it's mapped out the landscape, and it tells you what obstacles to avoid to get where you want to go. I think we're at the stage where we can start doing that for health. You want to get to 100 healthy years, Function's mission, for example.
Yes.
You want to make sure you're still capable of doing the things you care most about as you get older. Here are the things you need to avoid. Here are the dangers that are coming your way. Here are the things that you can do practically in order to get there.
And how close to that being a reality do you feel like we are?
The scientist in me is saying, hey, but yes, we still need to do some development. But the thing that I think excites me is it's no longer decades away. It's months and years away now, I think, from the tools I'm seeing, from the advances that are coming out.
There's another side of this coin which gets involved in privacy. How do you think about that with what's happening to this data and the privacy? Or do you create these things and somebody else worries about making sure they're being used correctly?
My final chapter of the book, which is titled The Future of Seeing, like the book itself, I actually present two starkly different pictures of possible futures. One sort of a bright future in which we use omnipresent cameras to promote equity and to share knowledge and to even ultimately expand our own sensorium. Maybe X-ray vision will be something that we all have one day. On the other hand, there's the dark mirror in which there is no such thing as privacy anymore.
Right.
I mean, if you're walking through a modern city, you're observed by countless cameras every step of the way. That can be weaponized. Let's say we do eventually figure out how to tap into our natural visual pathways and expand our vision. Well, then what you see could actually be hacked. So I think this is a really good time to step back and realize, hey, imaging is about seeing. Let's make sure that we maintain some sense of, if not privacy, then truth, that we can trust in what we see. The challenge we'll have to deal with is that always there is the temptation then to isolate oneself in a bubble and just see the things one wants to see. So we have our stark choice right there. Do we just see the things we want to see, just basically digest the sources of images that we want, or do we open ourselves up to this vast set of new perspectives and start thinking a little more like a species?